Thank you and welcome for joining us for this book launch for the Ethics, Ethnography in Education. And what we're going to do today is welcome some of the editors and some of the author contributors who will talk about their chapter in due course. So in terms of the presentation outline, what I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of contextual information about how the book came about. And then I will outline chapter 1 and chapter 3 and some of the other author contributors. We'll talk to their chapter and we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions. Here you'll see information about how to buy the book, and there is a 30% discount code, which is EEE30, if any of you are interested in purchasing the book once we've finished speaking. Just a little bit of background. Jonathan Tummins, Ruth Barley and Shari Sabetti, we organise an Oxford Ethnography and Education conference. And during that conference, we started to talk about ethical challenges that we'd experienced as educational ethnographers in the field. So we started talking about things, put a book proposal together to Emerald, and well, a couple of years later, here we are with the book Ethics, Ethnography and Education. The book itself draws on a diverse range of studies based in England, Scotland, South America, India and the Basque Country. And basically each author reflects on their experiences of how they've managed ethics in the field and beyond through to dissemination, and they offer valid and honest accounts about how these issues have been managed. So in a nutshell, what the book's trying to do is it problematises tensions experienced when managing ethics in situ, in the field, while simultaneously working within the bounds of current ethical regulations, which are on the increase. You know, as educational researchers, we are all we all need to adhere to an increase in ethical regulations. And the book specifically looks at issues around data ownership, dissemination, representation, and also social justice. I think when you're working in an area of social justice, there are particular ethical issues that you might want to think about. And these are discussed in relation to ethnographies conducted both during the global pandemic and also prior, before the pandemic hit the world. Administrative and conceptual change are needed, we argue, to ensure that ethics doesn't sort of become this tick box exercise. It's much more complex than that, sometimes much more reactive than that. And we make an argument to say that ethnographers need to maintain a degree of professional identity and integrity and commit fully to conscientiously trying to manage ethics in situ, but also beyond in terms of dissemination and how we represent the participants that we work with. I start the book in chapter 1 by asking the question, should we really, as educational researchers, every research project might want to start with the question, is this ethical, and use this as a starting point, as a focus. All researchers have to grapple with ethics, but the argument that we lay out in the introduction is that this can be particularly challenging for ethnographers because we spend a long time in the field, we build up close relationships with different sorts of participants in the field. So there's a high degree of intimacy, a high degree of complexity, and we have a longevity in the field. So quite often we're in the field for quite some time, and sometimes ethical regulations actually shift during the course of fieldwork and beyond that, as ethnographers, we need to grapple with. In the first chapter, I tried to draw a distinction between what Silverman describes as everyday ethics, so how we actually manage ethics in the field, on the ground, and what Strathern distinguishes as formalised ethics, so things that we might typically see in ethical review boards. And not for one moment are we suggesting that there is no need for ethical review boards, rather that ethnographers must try to retain their ethical expertise and be able to react to situations as they happen in the field. And so really need to commit fully to conscientiously managing ethics in situ and also beyond. Ruth Barley and I also contribute to chapter 3, which is titled Managing Ethics when Working with Young People and Children. And what we try to argue is that in recent years, ethnography working with children, young people and families has become increasingly prominent. It's something that's increasingly happening, yet there's not that much literature that looks specifically at young people and children and the ethics around that. Again, we argue that we need to sort of learn to manage ethics in situ, and this is really important when we're working with young people, because that power dynamic between the ethnographer, the researcher, and also the participants is in a constant state of flux. It shifts. And also that power dynamic between the participants themselves, if you're working in a collective as well as an individual one-on-one scenario, which quite often happens in ethnography, is something that the ethnographer needs to be mindful of. Also, ethnography can be very unpredictable, so we can't always preempt those ethical dilemmas that we're asked to preempt quite often in ethical review boards. And part of that is because we use a plethora of research methods. So in our ethnographic toolkit, we might use participatory research methods, participatory observations, interviews, and a whole host of other research methods, which might require tweaked or slightly different consent forms or conventions of trying to gain informed consent. Again, we operate over this longitudinal basis, which sort of adds to the complexity of managing ethics. And sometimes not all of these things are sort of preempted or adequately captured by the formal ethical regulation boards. Ruth and I touch upon a number of issues in the chapter. We think about issues of consent, data ownership, how we deal with sensitive data, which quite often happens when you're working with children and young people, and also thinking about intervention and when we perhaps should intervene in the field and not, particularly which is particular relevance, I think, when you're thinking about working in the area of social justice. So in this chapter, I draw upon a piece of research that was Leverhulme Trust funded that I did with Professor Robin Simmons and Dr. Ron Thompson, where we were looking at neat young people's experiences, so people who were not in employment, education and training. Some of that field work happened mobile in the car as I was driving young people to doctor's appointments and that kind of thing. So how consent was managed was quite in situ, in mobile, and it's sometimes important to verbal consent over and above sometimes that of written was needed. Make an argument to say that sometimes even written consent when you're working with young people and children could actually act as a barrier in some instances. And there were issues where we were managing welfare and legal matters, such as dealing with young people who had dealings in the informal economy and how we managed that. So we talk through and reflect on some of those experiences throughout the chapter. What I'd like to do now is pass on to Poonan Sharman, who has chapter 4 in the book, and she's going to talk about research ethics, reflections from fieldwork with children in India. Okay, Poonan.
Hi, thank you very much, Lisa. I am talking about chapter 4, which is based on my doctoral research work, which was an ethnographic study, a year-long ethnographic study based in Delhi, which is the national capital of India. It's a town where the research was being conducted. And in this particular chapter, I basically argue that cultural context shapes the way research ethics emerge on the field and the way decision making is done by the researcher on the field. And most importantly, I try to reflect upon how children are positioned by the researcher and how children are positioned by the families and the people on the field, and that contradiction that exists. So, for example, a lot of research work with children, especially in South Asian context, is driven by a Euro-American sort of imagination of childhood, what a childhood should be, and how should the researcher behave on the field. But then again, cultural context becomes extremely important in the way the researchers make a decision at a particular time in a particular scenario, and that also involves a lot of their own experiences as a child in that particular society. So that's exactly what I try to reflect on. There are four specific dilemmas that I talk about. So first of all, the first dilemma is about rapport building with children, so I researched with four different families, and within these four different families which were located in the same geographical region, there were differences in the way I developed my rapport with the children. Some of them needed more sort of a casual, one of the family needed a more casual sort of interaction, and with the other family, it was more formal, where I had to introduce storytelling and do some paper folding with children to begin the process of building the rapport with them. The second is I reflect on what was my perception on the field and how people looked at me, being a woman researcher, being a Hindu person, being an unmarried person. So these were the ways in which people understood me on the field. And that also, in many ways, shaped the way research ethics emerged on the field. The third is the contradictory position of children. And in the Indian context, and that would be true for a lot of other South Asian countries as well, there is an adult-child continuity that indigenous researchers argue about, which is in contradiction with the way children are understood in the Western and Euro-American context. So I reflect upon that. And the fourth dilemma is regarding whether in a particular situation should I intervene or not intervene, and how do I make that decision of holding back or intervening while there is something happening on the field. So how do I make that decision as an ethnographer? So that's precisely about my chapter. Scholars who are interested in South Asian context and childhood in South Asian context would definitely find it useful. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Poonam. We'll take questions at the end in the chat if that's okay. And now, Elizabeth, if we move on to your chapter 5, revisiting the ethics of Basque educational ethnographic research based on a post-qualitative inquiry, a proposal for inclusive ethics. The floor is yours, Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you. So the title of our chapter is Revisiting the Ethics of Basque Educational Ethnographic Research based on a post-qualitative inquiry, our proposal for inclusive ethics, and it is authored by José Miguel Correa Gorospe, who is here, Eider Chávez Gallastegui, who is also here, and myself. Well, this chapter addresses what we did in our research project. It is a very broad research project, and we took some very specific elements to comment through, right? So we address mainly researcher positionality when relating to research collaborators in an attempt to manage inclusive ethics in situ. And we will go through what we understand by inclusive ethics. So we took a collaborative approach, and we are based on the idea that researchers and participants should be collaborators and dialogue and negotiate during interviews and participant observation, and we will go through that, involving different narrative and multimodal representations, and also participants' self-observations. So we are based on the post-qualitative inquiry, which enabled us to question traditional modes of research. And the methodological approach we took was, of course, we embraced ethnography, but we approached it in a non-traditional way. So what we did was different encounters with higher education students, in our case, were IT students, education students, yes, and philosophy student, and we did different encounters one-to-one with them. In the first encounter, we broke the ice with them. We talked with them about some preconceptions about young people, and then we asked them to represent their learning trajectory graphically. In the second encounter, we talked about that, about their learning trajectory, and then we asked them to be autoethnographers, right? So we asked them to go into the field, but to self-observe themselves and to note in a field note what they were self-observing from themselves. And then we analyzed that data collaboratively in a third encounter. And then we collaboratively again created a narrative on their learning trajectory, right? Doing all of that enabled us to change the way we position towards them. Of course, every case was different, and we have addressed 3 different cases as mentioned in our chapter. In the first chapter, the education student well engaged in her research, but at some point she decided to drop out. Yeah. And that made Ada, of course, ethically position herself in a different way. What was that implying, right? And what should we do, or what should she do about it, right? Yeah. In the case of Jose Miguel, what he did was he was doing these encounters with an IT student, and in the second encounter, the student revealed he had Asperger and Asperger's syndrome, and this also made him reflect on how the data was being collected, how should he relate to him. And in my case, I was relating to a philosophy student who was brilliant and of course knew much more than I could do, and of course she was doing most of her work. So this made us delve and analyze all our data, and we came to the conclusion that we needed inclusive ethics, that is an ethics that include our participants and engage them into their research, because it is the narrative that we are constructed towards or about them. So we should create that collaboratively, and this is the main point of our chapter. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. If we move now on to Matilda Stahl-Frederick Rusk's chapter, which is Maintaining Participant Integrity, Ethics and Fieldwork in Online Video Games. Over to you, Matilda.
All right. Hi, everyone. So great to meet you. Finally be here to the people involved in this book. I have the props with me as well. So yeah, I'm Matilda Stahl, and I have co-authored chapter 6 together with Fredrik Rusk. So this chapter is called Maintaining Participant Integrity, Ethics and Fieldwork in Online Video Games. So you can, of course, by doing ethnographic work online, you can get access to all of these kind of cool communities, niche communities, this kind of very interesting phenomena that might not have occurred outside of an online context. But it also means that, okay, there is going to be methodological and ethical challenges that we have not necessarily faced before. For example, if you're doing fieldwork from your own, or your own home, your own like office space, what is then the field? And furthermore, like if you want to access the participant's perspective, how can you do that if you have very limited or no at all kind of face-to-face interaction with these participants? So all of these kind of, there are new challenges, so to say. And to be honest with you, this was not this chapter. I'm really happy that it came to be, but it was not one of those we had planned, a long time. It was more of a situation where I think it was Lisa who pitched this book to me, and I realized, yeah, we have a lot of these kind of ethical challenges that would be great to have a chance to actually sit down and reflect and work through, because we didn't necessarily have any kind of. There were, of course, guidelines that helped us to some extent, but not in all cases. So we had to come up with these kind of in situ situations, or like solutions to a lot of the challenges that we faced. And that is essentially what this chapter is about. But so the context here is there are students playing the online multiplayer game Counter-Strike within an educational context. They're part of this esports program. And the data consists of screen recordings that they did themselves on their own devices of in-game play. That is what I'm trying to say, and of course, as well as focus group interviews together with the students. And when we started doing the screen recording, we realized that okay, there are going to be players present in this material that are co-observed. So we started thinking, okay, how could we get informed consent from them? Of course, we had informed consent from the people involved in the project, but what about the people who are co-observed? Their avatars, their names might pop up, you know. So I suggested this approach where that is quite common in streaming. So if you stream an online game, prior to streaming that game, you say in the lobby that, hey, okay, I'm going to stream this game on Twitch. Here's the link, just so you know. And I suggested a similar approach that, hey, could I write this, copy paste, introduction so that you could paste that in terms of ethics so that we can get informed consent. However, the participants said that they weren't comfortable doing that because they felt that if they let people know that this is recorded and they then fail, they lose, then we'll get a lot of backlash in terms of that. So in order not to potentially harm the participants, we decided that we can't, harm the participants, obviously. So we had to come up with a different solution. And after a little while thinking about this, we realized that the problem was that we tried to kind of force this one-size-fits-all solution. We had to separate these participants into different groups. The active participants, those who were part of the project, who shared really private data with us, private discussions, and we also focused analysis on them. And then there were these passive participants who were just, so to speak, in the background, but they were of course there, but we had to kind of find a way to tackle both groups and how to make sure that everyone's privacy and integrity was respected, but however, that was not necessarily the same way for both of these groups. So that is, in a nutshell, one of the challenges that we faced. I'm happy to answer any questions after all the presentations are done. Thank you.
Thanks, Matilda. So if we move on to Yang Zhao now, who's chapter 7, Adapting Ethnographic Methods in Light of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Scottish Country Dancing. Over to you, Yang.
Hello. So before I start, I will just send a few links here so like people could better understand the organization that I have been researching on, the Royal Scottish Country Dance Society, abbreviation RCDS, that you could see that there are lots of branches around the world. And this online blended ethnography is pretty much closely linked to this organization. And to begin with, this chapter, Adapting Ethnographic Methods in Light of the COVID-19 Pandemic, Scottish Country Dancing, is based on two projects. One is my master's correspondence degree that I conducted the country dance research in Lyon and Edinburgh in 2017 to 2018. And another research I conducted is my ongoing PhD project. And this chapter, I was discussing the differences between the traditional in-person ethnography and the online blended ethnography. And the tricky thing is that because I'm doing research on dance, and particularly Scottish country dancing is a social dance that people need to interact with each other. So there are lots of differences that I talked through during the chapter. And I started with my background and introduction of the Royal Scottish Country Dance Society and the Scottish country dance itself. And then I talk about the face-to-face fieldwork in Lyon and Edinburgh in 2017 to 2018. And the main research methods I used were textual analysis, participant observation, interviews, and research diary. And these are very conventional, traditional ways. And then I moved to the doctoral fieldwork, that I moved to online research. Because of the pandemic, there were no in-person dance classes, and the RSCDS, they shifted their goals, and some of the groups, they started the online classes. And the methods I used including textual analysis, interviews, that I still continued, and I discontinued questionnaires for several reasons. That if you are interested, you are more than welcome to read the chapter. And and also the field notes, mainly based on the online field notes. Again, just because there were no in-person classes, and the methodology I used, I called it blended ethnography because primarily I conducted the research online, but then the lockdown was shifted. So some of the classes, they returned to the dance floor. So I did go to the in-person classes a few times. And my standpoint and positionality, including as a dancer, as a researcher, as a non-native dancer, that apparently I'm from China and I'm not from Scotland, that I do not have background in Scottish culture or Scottish country dancing, but because of the long time immersed in the field that I built relationships with dance teachers and dancers and also the organizations. So like my standpoint from an outsider became an insider. So that's and also there are some ongoing ethical considerations. For example, like the online lurking issues and my my identity need to be clarified to the participants. So these issues were discussed in the chapter. And I think that's all I wanted to say for today.
Oh, thank you very much, Yang. It's over to Jonathan now, who has 2 chapters in the book and is also a fellow editor. I'll leave it to you, Jonathan.
Thank you very much. I'm the author of 2 chapters. The second chapter of the 2 is really just the conclusion for the text as a whole, and draws together some of the broad themes from across the work as a whole, in terms of the the sort of common issues that come out, the mediation of the digital standpoint of researcher, ethics as process rather than product, and things like that. So I'm not going to say anything more about that, because really all that is just a summary of all the work done by all my fellow authors, who've all done excellent jobs in their own different spheres. So I'll just finish up, if I may, by spending about whatever I've got left, about 4 minutes, talking about the chapter, the main chapter that I've written. What I've been trying to do in this chapter is this. So for those who've met me before, I've spent about 4 years now painstakingly working my way through some of the later work written by Bruno Latour. He is now he's now retired, a French philosopher and sociologist, winner of lots of awards, and has written lots of books, as everyone knows. And what I've been drawing on is his later work, which he titles An Inquiry into Modes of Existence, which is a way of bringing together all the different threads from across the intellectual project that he's followed throughout his academic career. So we all know something about actor network theory, perhaps, which is the best known of these, but he's also written about law, about the philosophy of knowledge, epistemology, and many other things as well. Technology is another key theme for his work. And he puts together within Modes of Existence a series of frameworks for thinking about the world around us and the things that we do as social beings. And I've taken some of these ideas in order to make some inquiries about what's going on when we talk about research ethics as ethnographers, perhaps more generalizably in terms of interpretive research as well. So what I think is going on, so I'm not going to talk about the Latourian theory because we don't have time. I'll just tell you a little something about the different conclusions that I drew based on Latour's frameworks for thinking. So the first thing that I think I'd like to foreground is that research ethics is something we need to think about as an objectivized body of knowledge. There is no thing called research ethics out there waiting for us to simply pick up off a shelf and use. It's something that has to be constructed over time. It's bound up in all kinds of different ways and in different places. And the way that it's wrapped up within a committee, for example, is always going to be different to the way in which it is wrapped up in terms of what we do in the field. The reflexive relationships we have with our respondents, with the spaces and places that we do our research in, is sometimes difficult, if not arguably impossible, to predict in a scientific or quasi-scientific manner, in the way that an ethics application process of the kind that we increasingly see in education research, informed by sort of the growth of an audit, the greater growth of an audit culture, and informed by medicalized models of research ethics of the kind discussed by, say, Atkinson and Delamont over many years, is now starting to shape what we do as well. And what I'm arguing is that we need to think about what happens with ethics from a number of different perspectives, not only in terms of filling the form in, but where those forms go next, the conversations that lead to those forms, the more or less conscious compromises that we make when applying for ethical approval from a committee, and whether or not that is actually an ethical thing to do in itself. To provide one easy argument, I would say this, that, for example, at my institution, if you're doing an interview-based study or interviews within an ethnography, you have to provide a list of the questions that you're going to ask before the ethical approval can be given. But it may well not be the case that it is either desirable or indeed possible to predict the conduct of an interview within the field in such a manner that seems almost deterministic, as opposed to something more organic or interpretivist in the way that we might expect as ethnographers. So pulling all these things together, and then just to conclude, sorry if it's a little bit wordy, what I think is going on is this, is that we need to think about research ethics not as a process that we have to abide by. We don't have to think about it solely as a tool of audit, although these things are true within certain areas of university and academic life. My argument instead is that we need to think about research ethics as a social actor. And this is where the Latourian philosophy comes through very strongly, where we grant agency to non-human as well as human actors within social constructs. So if we think that research ethics is then capable, as a phenomenon, is capable of agency and is capable of intent and is found captured within both verbal speech and written discourse, and can then travel in concrete or reified forms as well as through our voices, then that allows us to reframe our inquiry into what we think ethics are doing. Instead of asking questions such as, what are research ethics? How do we do ethical research? And I would suggest that we've got a lot of literature that already responds to these questions in a great amount of detail. I think an interesting question, and I'm afraid it takes a whole chapter just to get to this bit, so sorry about that, but you need to show your workings in order to be convincing, I hope, is our real question is this: what do research ethics, understood as a social actor, do? What do research ethics do? And that's the thing I'm interested in finding more about. Thank you very much. I might well have about 60 seconds for questions, but if not, I'm afraid I need to rush off to a PhD tutorial. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. We do have another author, Diana Milstein, and she sent some slides in. I don't think that she's able to join us, but we do have slides. So if anybody's interested in Diana's chapter, which is entitled Ethical Dilemmas and Reflections in a Collaborative Study with Children During the Pandemic, let me know, and I'm sure Diana will be happy for me to pass those slides on. So with that, we'll come to a close in terms of the presentations. That's just been a kind of whistle-stop tour of those chapters, and open the floor to any questions. I mean, what we're hoping that the book does is it looks at ethics as a conceptual term, but also about how it's actually managed in the field in terms of some of our reflexive experiences, and has looked at issues around, you know, online ethnographies, face-to-face ethnographies, what happened during the pandemic and how people sort of managed ethics in the global pandemic. Feel free to share the advert for the book and use the 30% discount code. Okay, so Kevin's asked a question. As an editor, what would you say emerges from the book read as a whole? Yeah, well, there are a number of things. I think one of the key themes actually is this tension around, as particularly for ethnographers, around how we manage ethics in situ and beyond, and how sometimes that comes into contradiction with ethical review board guidelines. So a lot of the ethical review board guidelines are, as many of you are aware, have the foundations in sort of the medical model, and as Jonathan was just explaining then, can be quite prescriptive and deterministic. And the issue around ethnography and other sorts of research methods that you might use is that you can't always preempt or predict those ethical dilemmas, and we are experiencing an increased pressure, I think, to do that. So I think what it is, it's sort of how we negotiate that as ethnographers and maintain a certain level of professional integrity, I think, as well, because Martin Hammersley he's written loads about ethnography and ethics, and he's quite critical of the whole thing, and actually says that in some instances the ethnographer is losing their professional identity and almost can bypass responsibility for ethical issues onto ethical guidelines or the people on the ethical review boards, which arguably is a really dangerous place to be. I don't think we're making such a strong statement as that in the book, but just to sort of be aware that there sometimes can be tensions. So I don't know if anybody else wants to chip in there about key themes that may have emerged. I think I'm the only editor left standing, Kevin. So any other questions? Well, maybe we'll draw that to a close if we've bamboozled everybody. I'd like to thank everybody for attending. Particular thanks go to my colleagues who've made this book happen, and obviously to Emerald Press as well, who pulled all the book together. So many thanks for everybody contributed and participated in today. And if you have any questions or any information that's missing here, just drop me a line and I'll happily provide you with that. So with that, I'll draw the session to a close, and thank you very much. Bye.